So it's good to see you all here today. I wasn't entirely sure that I was actually going to make it. As my dad mentioned, I had quite the adventure in getting down here yesterday. I was supposed to make a connection in Philadelphia and missed that connection by 5 minutes. So rather than going from Boston to Philadelphia to Asheville, I went Boston to Philadelphia to Allentown to Charlotte to Asheville. But it was the only route that they could send me on that was actually going to have me be here in time for the symposium, so I was happy to do it. As my father mentioned, I am an alumna of Harvard University. I did a joint Master in Public Policy and Master in Business Administration program there, and I graduated in May of 2012. And during my time at the Kennedy School, I had the tremendous opportunity to take a postdoctoral seminar on sustainability science that was taught by Professor William Clark, who, for his contribution to the field, was granted a MacArthur Genius Award. And his vision for this particular course was to bring together the who's who of the sustainability world and have each professor who was at the very apex of their field teach one session. So I had the chance to learn not only from Bill Clark, but from Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom shortly before she passed away, as well as a number of other just key thinkers. Gretchen Daly at Stanford was also there. And so this particular talk that I'm about to give uses the same framework that we used for addressing the question of sustainability in Bill Clark's course. And I'll be applying much of what I learned there. So one of the key quotes that I think really gets us honed in on what it is we need to talk about is Albert Einstein's quote that we cannot solve tomorrow's problems by using the same kind of thinking that we were using when we created them. So essentially, if we're not careful, we're going to end up where we're headed. So where exactly are we headed, and is that somewhere that we want to go? Well, let's take a look. I've got a few metrics that I've pulled together here to kind of encapsulate where it is that we're headed. According to the US DOE, per capita carbon emissions in the United States are more than 5 metric tons per person per annum, and the developing world is racing to catch up. Many professors, including Gretchen Daly at Stanford, and many of the scientists who are part of the National Academy of Sciences at this point are predicting that we're going to lose 50% of the planet's biodiversity in the next 100 years. Half of all of the species that exist on the planet today will not exist 100 years from now if we don't change the trajectory we're on. A little closer to home, thinking about food, the average distance from farm to table that food travels is 1,500 miles in the United States. 1,500 miles. So if you think about the number of calories that are included in the fuel that it actually takes to get the food to your mouth, that exceeds the number of calories that you're actually consuming in a wide number of instances. Obviously, the list could go on. So I'd like to talk about some tools and technologies for sustainable development. And first, I'd like to really ground us in a conversation about what sustainable development is and what sustainable development is not. So there are a number of definitions for sustainable development. As an outcome, sustainable development means an equilibrium between the forces of community, ecology, and economy. This stands in contrast to balance, which is effortful. So I can stand on one foot and balance all day long, but it takes work. Equilibrium is natural. And also, as an outcome, sustainable development is resilient to a broad variety of different types of shocks. Sustainability as a field, sustainable development as a field of inquiry broadly means people grappling with the appropriate long-term relationships between human development and the natural environment. Sustainable development can also be thought of as a minimum standard for our ongoing interactions with the natural world. So I think it's interesting that we tend to relate to the term sustainable as though it's some sort of a goal, like the apex, the ultimate of what we're after, when what makes a lot more sense is to consider it a minimum standard. If the way that you're approaching interacting with the natural world now implies that if you keep doing what you're doing, the life support systems of this planet are going to break down, you're not exactly hitching your wagon to the stars by holding that as the gold standard. And I get that it's an incredibly challenging notion just to get to the point where we are sustainable, but I see that as a minimum standard, and in sustainable development, that's oftentimes how it's conceived. So moving forward, one caveat for this talk is that I'm talking about what will work from an ecological perspective, and I am doing that absent any considerations of the legal structures that now are applied to the land that we hold. So what I'm talking about is I'm saying that there are two conversations here. There's one conversation about what would actually work in terms of being sustainable, and then there's another conversation about what's feasible given the legal structures that we have already put in place for land use, given the existing paradigm, which I think most of us recognize is going to need to be turned on its head to a great extent in order to create something that's going to work. So one of the primary tools that we used in Bill Clark's class, and one that I have found particularly valuable, is the inclusive wealth formula. The inclusive wealth formula was originally conceived of by an economist named Partha Dasgupta, who is very interested in creating a sustainable world. And the inclusive wealth formula is a way to ground us in a conversation about what it is that we should be striving for. It's not intended to be solved mathematically, like one day somebody's going to sit down with a pen and paper and come up with the appropriate answer and eureka, I've got it. This is not E equals MC squared. This is how can we frame a conversation around what it means to be sustainable. And the inclusive wealth formula says that human well-being is a function of a certain number of factors. Those factors are natural capital, provided by the natural world, human capital, social capital, mechanical or manufactured capital, knowledge, institutions, and population. Different people formulate this particular formula differently. Here I have it as being a multiplicative function because I think that captures the notion that if any one of those terms goes to zero, the entire equation goes to zero. So there is a limit as to the substitutability. And here you'll also see that I have population as a divisor because there's a total number of resources and total amount of well-being to be distributed broadly, and that it has to be divided up in some fashion among the people who get to enjoy or experience that well-being. Dasgupta thought that any rational and reasonably equitable society would be striving to maximize this formula. And the minimum standard according to inclusive wealth is that it doesn't fall. It's a stock function, not a flow function. So it says this is everything that we have now that is capable of producing flows of well-being into the future for our children, for ourselves when we're older, for generations 1,000 years forward. And what we're solving for is ensuring that that does not fall. Future generations will be capable of enjoying the same levels of well-being that we enjoy now, and ourselves when we're older. So the available stock of well-being for future generations is not falling as a function of how we're interacting with the planet or interacting with each other at this point in time. So, more simply put, plain English, this is what the inclusive wealth formula has to say. So, I'd like to kind of go into what each of these means in practical terms, and that's what I'm going to spend a few minutes doing now, is actually saying, well, we have this inclusive wealth formula, but what is the value of each of these terms to us? So here we have natural capital, which is important because it provides a flow of ecosystem services that we receive from the natural environment. Human capital, which generally includes the two factors of health and education. It is not population, it is not number of people. Social capital is the enjoyment that we receive from being part of a society and experiencing reciprocal social relationships. Manufactured capital is fairly self-explanatory, human-made objects and constructs. Knowledge and institutions represent our accumulated wisdom and the rules we've devised to create workability in cohabitating together. And population, of course, represents the total of number of individuals over which that stock of goods must be divided. The high level is that when we're thinking about land use, all of these factors should be taken into account. We should not be leaving any of them out, because they all have a major factor on our well-being. You can apply the inclusive wealth formula to just about any type of decision that involves an interaction between humans and the natural environment, but land use is particularly well suited to this type of an analysis. So, starting with natural capital, I'm sure that you've all seen this in some form or fashion in the past. So there are four basic types of ecosystem services that flow from the natural capital that we have available. I'm going to take a moment to say that this is going to be a human-centric presentation. So there is a whole argument to be made about the right of other creatures to persist and to enjoy continued existence as a species and to have quality of life. For the purpose of time constraints, that's not something I'm going to consider here. So we'll be grounding this in a conversation about human well-being. But there are types of flows of well-being that come to humankind from the natural world. Provisioning services are everything included in fuel, fiber, minerals, raw materials, medicinal ingredients. Support services include seed dispersal, pollination, nutrient dispersal, cycling, so think the water cycle. Regulating services are things that keep the ecosystem stable. Carbon sequestration, decomposition of wastes, purification of water, air, etc. And cultural services include recreation and ecotourism, and our experience of beauty, spiritual enrichment we get from spending time in nature. One final and important element of natural capital, mostly because it affects the value of the preceding four types of services that is often left out, is biodiversity, and the question of how much biodiversity a piece of land can support, should support, and how to maximize that. It's a critical element not only of cultural services, think charismatic megafauna that people like to interact with, which are a core part of North Carolina's tourism industry, but also other substantial benefits, particularly in the form of resiliency. So when you reduce the genetic diversity within a species, that species becomes much more susceptible to future shocks, ecological shocks. And when you reduce the diversity among species, you're creating instability because oftentimes more than one species will provide the same ecosystem service. So you'll have a flower, for example, that's pollinated by more than one type of bee. And if you have only one of those remaining, if that bee is gone, then so goes the flower. Human capital is health, work, and educational opportunities, and that human capital really refers to the flows of well-being that stakeholders enjoy as a function of the education which they have and the health that they enjoy. And the sustainability conversation and the human capital conversation intersect because environmental degradation, which is often caused by our land use choices, affects the productivity, longevity, and physical well-being of those that occupy the land. Land decisions also affect human capital because they cause or mitigate pollution and environmental toxicity, which increases, preserves, or erodes the community's ability to grow local organic food. It creates or eliminates jobs. It changes the geography of opportunity by adding or eliminating schools, housing, medical facilities, et cetera, and also those critical cultural services that we receive from the land. So I would personally have a much less enriched and much less educated life had it not been for the fact that my father spent a huge portion of my childhood hiking with me. And I credit that for the fact that I could probably wander out into the woods today and subsist happily for quite some time. I know what to eat and what not to. I know what's poisonous. I know what has medicinal value. And that's a critical source of education that I received from growing up here in Western Carolina that I wouldn't have had if everything had been turned into ticky-tacky boxes on the hillside before I was born.
Social capital is community, affiliation, enfranchisement, and our shared experience. The study of social capital is an interesting factor, and it's one that we don't often think about when we think about land use decisions, but it is important. It's a field that has really been developed in recent decades by Harvard professor Robert Putnam, who wrote the landmark book Bowling Alone, which is an empirical inquiry into the decline of social cohesion and social capital in the United States. And there's another Harvard professor, of course, who I'm familiar with that has been a pioneer in this field, and that's Dr. Amartya Sen, who is a prolific researcher and author that looks at the alleviation of poverty and different strategies that we can take to enfranchising low-income groups. And so when we think about land use, the intersection of land use and social capital, we need to think about access to community and affiliation groups. So how is it that we promote the development and maintenance of both strong and weak social ties that grant less enfranchised members of the community access to opportunity? How do we really think critically about whether we are creating a community that is accessible and equitable by all members who live in that society? Are we relegating disadvantaged groups to the fringes of society? Is this a luxury good that we're creating with this land that's not going to be accessible by everyone? There is a time-honored tradition, in particular in North Carolina, of relegating minority families and those living in poverty to subsidized urban housing complexes in economically distressed areas, and having the wealth living in somewhat sprawling suburban estates. There have actually been a number of important landmark legal cases here from the state of North Carolina around the fact that primarily African-American communities tend to be systematically located more in very close proximity to like nuclear waste sites and sites that have serious ecological instability. So when we're thinking about land use, are we prohibiting or are we promoting the growth and development of equitable social capital? Are we enfranchising or disenfranchising in the way that we're choosing to use the land? Manufactured capital, of course, refers to anything that is a product of human invention. And the intersection of manufactured capital and land use really falls in thinking about to what extent the land use decisions we're making increase or decrease access to stocks of manufactured capital, but also the question of at what cost is that manufactured capital being produced? Are we creating something that is meeting a pressing community need? What is the opportunity cost of building this manufactured capital? So what are we losing in the process? And how are we thinking about preserving the natural capital of the land in creating manufactured capital on this area of land? So are we using the principles of industrial ecology and closed-loop systems? Are we creating waste outputs from the production process, which are no productive input to anything at all? I think we oftentimes forget, in particular with land use decisions, that there is no a way to throw things into. We're on this little delicate green bubble that's floating in space, and there isn't an a way. You have to find somewhere, some way to deal with the waste that's being produced. And one sort of framing that I use in my own life is to think about, what if my house were a closed-loop system? How would I think about producing garbage if I had to find somewhere in my own closet to put it after it was created? And so you can really use that principle at any scale, and it's one that I think is valuable in evaluating land use. Knowledge includes the systematic inquiry, actionable insight, and indigenous understandings. And it's interesting because we tend to rely very much on the first of those three when evaluating land use choices, and very little on the second, too. So we'll perform some sort of systematic inquiry and then not take the time to translate that into any sort of actionable insight. So we'll do an environmental impact assessment, for example, and say, well, this is what we understand about what's going to happen. And so we get the so, but don't take the time to translate that into the so what. So what does this imply about how we can move forward, how we should move forward, how we should not move forward? And actionable insight is really where the rubber meets the road. So there's no point in performing the systematic inquiry of the so if you never intend to translate that into some sort of actionable so what. A lot of the so what has a tendency to come from indigenous communities, and we oftentimes forget about that as well. So we oftentimes act as though the only source of valuable learning or wisdom about how to interact with the land comes from that systematic inquiry, even though we don't use it. And there is an entire field of thought about recognizing the indigenous wisdom of people who've lived on a place for a very long time, even if what they have to say can't be empirically and scientifically validated. That does not imply that it isn't useful and isn't valuable. It's like we oftentimes want to come in and say, well, we understand, we have all this scientific inquiry, so we're going to come in and help you steward the land. And what we're forgetting in that process is that if they hadn't been already doing a good job, there would be nothing to come in and preserve. Institutions for managing human environment systems include the vast array of agreements, laws, norms, and expectations that humankind abides by. Broadly, that includes a set of considerations that are about how we use our shared resources or resources over which we've allocated the rights of private ownership, as well as the interactions between the two. So questions that are key in land use and institutions are: to what extent do we need to create and protect public goods or regulate, steward, and direct private commerce? What justifications do we perhaps have for doing so? One of the primary arguments for deep public involvement in private land use decisions is that those decisions generate externalities. So externalities exist when someone's private property decisions fundamentally impact the well-being of stakeholders who do not have a say in those decisions, and that will actually be the topic of my second talk. I'll be talking very much about the institutions piece of the puzzle at that point, so we'll sideboard the conversation for now, but I have very much to say. And then the final factor is population. So below the point where the population is actually large enough and stable enough to specialize, cooperate, and innovate, population serves as a multiplier in the inclusive wealth formula because more people can grow more food, produce more knowledge in institutions, press natural capital into productive service, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond the point at which you have sufficient knowledge capital and sufficient intelligence and sufficient manpower to accomplish that end, there are actually diminishing marginal returns to population, and beyond a point, the incremental value that is added to the equation is by an additional person and is outweighed by the fact that there's a fixed base of resources that must be divided over an ever-increasing number of people. So in thinking about population at a less than global scale, which is the scale at which we are accustomed to thinking about population, we can think instead about the notion of population density. In some areas, density makes sense. In others, for a multitude of reasons, the fragility of the ecosystem or the potential to use the land for some more constructive purpose, that type of density does not make sense. And deciding whether or how to develop an individual parcel of land, you have to think about the greater schema. City, county, biome, etc., that particular piece of land occupies, and the role of each parcel of land with respect to its potential contribution to the whole. And the fact that we do not think about this very critically is a source of a great amount of environmental harm. So locating extraordinarily toxic sites next to watersheds, rivers, etc., etc. And there's a whole field of thought called land architecture that is about looking at a region and saying, what does it make sense to put where? And I'll be talking about that in my second talk as well. So I want to spend just the last few minutes talking about some emerging fields of thought in the area of sustainable development that relate and are important for land use that are extremely critical. First is the question of land use architecture, which we're all familiar with this type of an aerial map. They're often used to describe where things are and to talk about how various pieces of land have been pressed into service to date. But land architecture actually takes an integrated, holistic view of the area and asks the question, what does it actually make the most sense from a sustainable development perspective? Again, setting to the side questions of the existing paradigm of land use and land rights. What does it actually make sense to put on this land? So let's just bracket the conversation that things have developed ad hoc up to this point and think critically about what it actually makes sense to put where, so that we're implementing principles of smart growth and not just growing like a weed. So this involves asking questions like, if we want to minimize our environmental impact by having 80% of Asheville's food come from within 100 miles of the city, how much farmland do we actually need to accomplish that? How much farmland do we already have? And how can we leverage that farmland most productively in service of the needs of the community? If we want to preserve a contiguous ecosystem for animals that need space to roam, where should we put the people? Where should we avoid putting dense human development in order to preserve that contiguous ecosystem? What's sitting in or near our major watershed areas? What should be and shouldn't be? One of the major focuses of Bill Clark's postdoc on sustainability science that I got a lot out of was actually thinking about human environment systems from a complex systems perspective. And when you're thinking about complex systems, the important point is that the system is more than the sum of its parts. There are interactions, there are feedback loops, there are cross-scale dynamic tipping points, multiple equilibria, things that aren't reversible. And that frame of reference is critically important because we tend to assume, as just sort of a function of a heuristic, a simplicity heuristic, that things happen linearly on this planet, and they don't. So if you take, for example, the stock of fish that is in the Northeast, around the Boston area, there was this presumption that if they put regulations in place to keep people from overfishing, that the fish population would sort of linearly grow once again until it had reached its prior abundance. But it turns out that of the types of fish that they were interested in growing the population of, their population is typified by two equilibria, a high equilibria, which was experienced prior to the overfishing, and a low equilibrium, and that equilibrium state is sticky. So once you get stuck in that equilibrium, it's very hard to move out of. Interactions and substitutions. So unless you are Monsieur Mange Tout, who is the man who can eat anything, there are limits to our ability to substitute natural capital and manufactured capital, for example. You can't say, well, we're going to treat this like a mathematical formula which we're simply going to maximize, and as long as we're creating an equivalent stock of manufactured capital out of this natural capital, that's fine. Because you can't eat manufactured capital in most instances, or probably shouldn't. It's inadvisable. The last is cross-scale dynamics. And cross-scale dynamics are important because we tend to want to think of geography as a bubble. So what I do on this particular piece of land is not going to affect anything but this particular piece of land. That's not the way that it works. So you can actually make a decision at one very small scale and have that be something that has a huge impact. And the thing that has that happen is tipping points. So you're running across these interactions. So if I am making this one small choice to eliminate this piece of land, and what I do is I bifurcate a population of animals that actually require that much contiguous area or that much biological diversity to subsist, I can, by changing one small plot of land, actually disrupt the resiliency and the sustainability of that entire population of creatures. So this is a graph that just shows what I was talking about with the multiple equilibria. So we tend to act like our ecological sustainability at this point in time. We tend to act like we're the ball at the bottom of that big basin where it's going to take a lot of work to get us out of the current paradigm. And what we forget is that we've actually already done a lot of that work of ecological disruption. And we're more like the ball that's at point B, which is very close to tipping over that threshold. And if you tumble that ball into a stable equilibrium that you do not want, it can be incredibly difficult to get it back out of that basin, in just the same ways it's going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to restore the stocks of cod in the northeastern fisheries. And I will be back with you in a bit later to talk about the institution piece of it, the piece that I explicitly ignored in this talk. Thank you.